Now, if I may switch gears to another subject, Mr. President, briefly. On Monday, the Senate will be casting the most important vote on a conservation legislation, outdoors legislation, that we've had in 50 years. Now, that's quite a statement to make because we do lots of legislation here in the United States Senate. But I'm not exaggerating when I say that. This is a piece of legislation that will do more for our public federal lands, our national parks, our fish and wildlife lands, our Bureau of Reclamation lands, the lands that hunters and fishermen use, than any piece of legislation we've passed in at least 60 years. In addition, it will create permanent funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which has been a goal of Congress since it was passed first in 1964, reaffirmed by the Reagan Commission on Americans Outdoors, which I chaired in 1985 and 6. And finally, we're getting around to doing both of those things. This piece of legislation that I'm describing has the strong support of President Trump. In fact, it couldn't happen without President Trump because the Office of Management and Budget has to approve the method of funding we're using, and they have approved it, and it's in the President's budget. It has the support of 59 co-sponsors in this body, Democrats and Republicans who are working together on it in a remarkable way. People say that we're divided. Well, we are in lots of ways, but in other ways, we're not. I mean, ask Senators Burr and Cantwell and Daines and Gardner and Heinrich and King and Manchin and Portman and Warner. They're all in the middle of this. They'll all take credit for it, and I'll give them credit for it, but everyone recognizes it takes all of us. And why are we all in the middle of it? We have more than 800 sportsmen and outdoors groups who've endorsed this bill, more than 800. So you tell me the last time you saw President Trump, 800 outdoors and environmental groups, and 59 United States senators on both sides of the aisle in favor of a piece of legislation that has its policy what I believe is the most important piece of outdoors legislation in a half century. Here's what we're talking about. We're talking about leaky roofs. We're talking about access roads with potholes. We're talking about trails that are worn out so you slip and fall down when you go to hike. We're talking about sewage systems that are broken, shutting down whole campgrounds like the Chilhowie Mountain Campground at the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, which is shut for 2 years. 500 families usually use it every summer. They can't go because its sewage system is shut down. We're talking about dilapidated visitor centers from Washington, D.C. to Pearl Harbor. We're talking about the mall here in Washington, D.C. We're talking about our national treasures. We're talking about where we like to go. One of the organizations supporting this, or a group of them, represent 55 million fishermen and hunters. They'd like to have roads to get to the fishing hole. They'd like not to break the axle on their tire on the way. Families would like to be able to go to Pearl Harbor and see a good visitor center. And they'd like to be able to camp in the Smoky Mountains and find that it's not shut down because the bathroom doesn't work. That's what we're talking about here. This isn't exotic stuff, but it's what creates an environment for us to use this great American outdoors that we all love. Now, exactly how does it do that, briefly? Well, one part simply says that we're going to take the national parks, there are 419 national park properties, the national forests, the National Wildlife Refuges, and the Bureau of Land Management and Bureau of Indian Education, that's Indian schools. And we're going to take the deferred maintenance, that's all those things I talked about that are broken, and over the next 5 years, we're going to pay for half of that. We have about $12 billion that is deferred maintenance, and over the next 5 years, we'll reduce half that. Now, in the Great Smoky Mountains, for example, next to where I live, we have 235 million worth of deferred maintenance. The park has a $20 million a year budget. Now, how much of that $20 million, how long do you think it's going to take, $20 million annual budget, to deal with $235 million of deferred maintenance? It's never going to happen. It's never going to happen without this piece of legislation or something like it. So that's the first part. And President Trump, to his credit, said, well, go ahead and put in the bill the national forests, the National Wildlife Refuges, the Bureau of Land Management, and the Bureau of Indian Schools. We have a lot of Indian schools in this country that are broken down and need to be fixed. He said, put that in there. And there are a lot of tribal nations and a lot of hunters and fishermen who appreciate that support, which is why we have 800 different groups, outdoors groups, who are supporting it. And then there's the second part of the bill, which is the smaller part, which is a Land and Water Conservation Fund. That's a very simple idea. It was recommended by President Johnson's Rockefeller Commission in 1964, and it said this: let's set aside a certain amount of money every year, $900 million, half to the states, half to the federal government, and buy protected and buy land that ought to be protected. It might be a city park, it might be an inholding in a national park, could be any of those things. And that's been going on all that time. But what the agreement was in 1964 was, we will get the money to pay for it from offshore drilling. We'll create an environmental burden, that's allow offshore drilling, and we'll use it for an environmental benefit, that's the Land and Water Conservation Fund. That made a lot of sense, and every year Congress has appropriated a certain amount of money for that. But the idea was the amount would be certain. There would be $900 million every year, and that's never happened. In 1985 and 86, President Reagan appointed a commission to look at American outdoors. I was chairman of it, and the principal recommendation was to make the Land and Water Conservation Fund permanent and to have permanent funding. So for 60 years, presidents and Congresses have been trying to do this but haven't gotten done. Monday is the day to get it done. Monday is the day to get it done. So my hope is that all members of the United States Senate are back here for votes on Monday. Some of us have been a little delinquent in our attendance on the Monday votes, but we need 60 votes on Monday to advance the bill. And then we'll need 60 votes a couple of more times to pass the bill. And then it can go to the House of Representatives, where an identical bill has been introduced in the House. And it would seem to me that a bill like this, at a time like this, would be something we would all welcome and want to support. There's nothing any of us wants to do more than get outside of our homes and get in the fresh air. And these are the lands where we go. Some of them are city parks, some of them are big parks like Yellowstone and Yosemite and the Great Smokies, but they're our treasures. And they are run down. They are run down. The bathrooms leak, the sewage systems have closed campgrounds, the visitor centers are embarrassing in some cases, the roads have potholes, and the access roads aren't built for the fishermen. This is a chance to take care of that. So I'm looking forward to the vote on cloture on Monday. I hope we get a big vote and send a strong signal to the American people that we in the Congress have heard them, that even in a time of crisis like this, that we can work together and do important work. And there's one more aspect to it. This is an infrastructure bill. And infrastructure means lots of jobs. There are various numbers that are thrown around, 40,000, 100,000. But anytime you spend $14 billion over 5 years on projects that are ready to go in locations all over the country, especially in rural areas, that's going to help a country that has such a high unemployment rate. So most important conservation and outdoors legislation in 50 years, an infrastructure bill in addition to that, that sounds like a pretty good vote for Monday. I thank the President. I ask consent to include following